So, glad you could make it. Grab a seat, get comfortable, because we're about to get started. So, first, who am I? Well, simply put, my name is Brandon. I work on a team at Gusto called Service Modularity, but we are here more to talk about Capybara. So, let's go ahead and just get into that. Shall we get started? We begin with a curious case of a capybara named Courant. You see, years ago, Red had an encounter that would change the way he thought about testing, and it was after one of his proudest moments in working with his new application, a way to decide where in the world to go to dinner after these conference things happen to end for the day, and who to go with, not unlike what we probably find ourselves doing many of these nights. So why was Red so proud during all of this? Well, I've done it, 100% test coverage. I've proven that my application works. Nothing can go wrong, right? Red was elated, dancing around the room when he heard a scuttling at the window, peculiar sound. And he turned to find out what this might be when he was greeted by a strange sight, a capybara in magician's robes. That's indeed quite the application, young one. But may I ask, where are your end-to-end tests? Red stared, confused for a moment, trying to figure out what this capybara was doing in his window. But he had to ask first, what's an end-to-end test? And how in the world did you even get in here? This is on the 12th story. With a grin and a laugh, the strange capybara answered, "Oh, nothing terribly surprising. I just snuck in through the gaps in your unit tests. You'd be surprised how much you can slip through there, even with 100% coverage." Now, as to your first question, I believe I may be of some help. You may call me Courant the capybara, and I'm here to teach you that very thing. Red was not quite convinced by this strange capybara, but he found himself ever more curious as Courant began to teach. We start with type 1, types of testing. To start with, there are 3 types of testing we should concern ourselves with. Their variants, different names, as plentiful as the ways of testing, but for now we will call them unit tests, integration tests, and end-to-end tests. Unit tests, of which you're already familiar, focus on isolation and testing individual units of code, much like a building block. You'll have the most of these, and you'll find they're also the fastest to run as they focus on very small areas of code. The problem? Too tight, too focused, too many stubs, and don't really reflect the accurate behavior of your application and may allow behavior to slip through that you might not have intended. Next are integration tests. They focus on the integration of several units and how they happen to work together, much like several building blocks could make up a larger structure like, say, a wall. You might find these when testing things like controllers with request specs, or when testing model scopes when interacting with the database, or potentially when testing front-end components, but that's not why we're here today. We're here to talk about end-to-end tests. If unit tests are the building blocks in integration tests of basic structure, you'll find the end-to-end tests are the whole building, the water, the electricity, and all the people running around inside of it. They describe how your application works from the end-to-end perspective of the user, not from your code, but from your user. It's curious how they compose the smallest part of this pyramid, but yet, even despite being the fewest in number, they are probably the most valuable to your user to prove that your site does indeed work as they expect. So why is that important? Well, let's use an example real quick. Suppose a user wants to join a group on your site. They want to go to supper. And they get a 500 error or worse, nothing at all, a blank page, no error, no message whatsoever, and they have no idea what in the world's going wrong. If you happen to reply to that poor lemur that you have 100% test coverage, I don't think that they would care. What they would want instead is they would want their supper. That doesn't really matter to the user, does it? They want the site to work as intended, and that's why we write Capybara specs, to cover those critical flows of the site and prove that things actually do work at the end of the day. Now, they're not exactly free. No, of course not. You might notice that you write a lot more unit tests than you do end-to-end tests. That's to be expected, as there are a lot more units in your code than there are flows in the application. There are also costs. They're expensive. They create a lot of data. They can be slow to run, and on occasion, they can be rather temperamental or flaky. We can test that last point, but we can focus on that for later. For now, let's get into some testing. Part 2, our first end-to-end test. To start, we need to ask ourselves, what should a user be able to do with our site? What do we expect them to be able to do? What do you think? Well, I suppose I'd like to be able to make an account to find a group to go to dinner with. I haven't done much design yet, it's just plain HTML. What if we started there? That sounds like a lovely start. In fact, starting with plain HTML will keep us honest later and make our test more robust as we add styling and classes later. But first, we'll need a bit of configuration so I know how to interact with your site. We'll start with how I configure Capybara to interact with your code. A lot of times, I'll do this through a tool like Selenium, which allows me to interact with web pages. To start with, you probably want to see what I'm doing with testing, so you want a configuration which runs me in a browser or head mode. Let's take a look and step through this real quick. The first thing we do is we register a new driver, which we can call Selenium Debug Chrome. And at the end, we'll be setting this as our default driver. Then we'll want a few options for our new driver. The first is that we want it to run in incognito mode so we don't have anything weird carrying over like cookies or anything else like that. We want to disable extensions to prevent odd side effects. And we want developer tools to be open and the window size to be something reasonable so it's actually zoomed in. Naturally, the size can change later, but it gives us something to work with. Next up, we want a way to turn back on headless mode in case we don't want the browser running. We can do this with an environment variable named headless. Unsurprisingly, most of the above options won't apply in this case. Why disable GPU? Well, Windows has a few quirks, and we have to deal with that. And at the very end, we make our new Selenium driver using the Chrome browser with our options. Don't worry if you didn't catch all that, it will be in the notes whenever we're done here. So we need a few things to get going. First, we want to start with running this in head mode, which will actually show what we're doing. Now, whenever we're starting, we start with the basic structure here, and it's going to look very similar to your RSpec test. In fact, Capybara primarily runs an RSpec unless you're doing something different. We'll make a folder and we'll call it spec/system. You could also call it spec features or spec end-to-end or anything you really want. It doesn't matter. It's up to you. But let's start with a registration and a login test just to prove that we can actually create an account and we can log in as it. Notice I have a single method call in here, visit. Why? Well, we capybaras are quite lazy and I don't want to guess what to write, I want to know. So, how exactly do we do this? How do we know what to write given this web page? Well, we stick a binding.irb in there and we step through it piece by piece, right below the visit. This puts us in the context of our test, meaning we can interact with the web page from our IRB console and figure out what exactly this should be doing. So let's skip to a new view real quick to where we have the browser on top and the console down below. We'll keep DevTools closed for the moment, but they might come in handy later and we'll pop that in. So let's start by clicking the sign up link. If you notice, it's up there in the top left, and we can use something called click on to look for something that it can click on, whether it be a button or a link, and that can figure out the right link from only the text, interestingly enough. Even better is that we capybaras are very, very patient creatures. I'll wait at least 2 seconds by default unless you tell me to wait longer to make sure that link is on the page before I go on and say that I couldn't find it. Now let's press enter and see what happens here. It brings us to our registration form. Now, seeing this form, what exactly might you want to do here? What do you want to do as a lemur whenever you're interacting with this web page? Well, I suppose I want to fill in the name, email, password, and confirm password fields. Well, let's do just that then. We can see, as the astute animals that we are, 4 fields which should be filled in, which, as you mentioned, are name, email, password, and confirm password. We can use fill in to give them content, like name here, and press enter. And this is all we need to do to fill in that form field. What's fun is that form labels are more than enough for me as a capybara to find which fields should be filled in. And you'll notice up there that the text is now in that field. Now, let's do email next. Press enter and, oh, that's interesting. Oh, right, it used to be called login, but I thought that wasn't very clear, so I called it email instead. Well, let's take a look at the web console real quick and see what exactly we have there. Now, see this little arrow box over here in the top left corner of your Chrome window, of your developer tools? I circled in red for you so you can see it. If you click on that, we can go over to the email form field, click on that, and that's going to bring us directly to this, and we can find out that this field is still referencing login in multiple places for the name, for the ID, and for a few other things. So let's change that in the web console real quick just to make sure this works. Okay, so we've changed it over to email. We can try running fill in again, and it works, but only superficially. We do have to be careful here. We need to fix the underlying code, so let's take what we already have, move that over to our spec file, leaving the binding.rb, and run this again. So before we get into that, why do we care that email matches? Well, because screen reader users are going to be very confused by this, trying to figure out what in the world we're doing. Which brings us to a very important point, and if you get nothing else from my lesson here, it's that accessible code is testable code. Notice that we've been using names and roles to get nice things like click on and fill in by the names of these fields. That's not a coincidence. The more accessible your site is, the easier it is to test and less brittle it will be whenever we decide to add styling and everything else in the future. Now, getting back to it though. Our current test might look something like this by going with the behavior that we'd already implemented. And we'll be keeping the binding.rb so we can keep filling in the rest of our test. This particular practice is not test-driven development, it's what we call REPL-driven development, and can be very handy for things which already exist, so you can prove them out and see how they happen to work. Let's continue then. So we have two more form fields, the password and confirm password. I suggest our security-inclined friends look away for the moment. These are not production passwords, we promise. And we'll go ahead and press enter on that. And we'll notice that both of those are filled in, and we're at the point where we can create the account through the Create Account button. So we click it and see what happens. Now that that's succeeded, we can see two potentially interesting things on the page. Because as a capybara, I want to make sure that what we just did worked, and we have something to confirm. So up at the top of the page, you might notice a flash message saying an email has been sent with a link to verify your account. And you might also notice that the name of the new account is in the position of where sign-in used to be. These two are what we can use to write our expectations to ensure this process actually succeeded. And we can test them much like you would anything else in our spec. So these initial expectations might look like this, of expecting the page to have content, an email has been sent, and expecting it to have that username. Now with this, we have our spec written, and we can go ahead and run it. After we fill in the rest of that, take out the binding.rb, and it can then run on its own. So back to the spec, we would end up with something which looks like this. And if we go ahead and run that, we'll see that it happens to work. But you might ask yourself, why in the world are we testing road auth Rails? Didn't Jeremy Evans do a good enough job testing that? Well, of course he did. Yes, he's a very smart individual. But he cannot guarantee how that particular feature is working in our application with our gems and our context. So we do want to test that just to make sure this process still works, which is where we get a lot of value out of these processes. Should we take a look at that next? Into the flow. And a convenient break. In general, you should have a test for every major flow of your application. Logging in, signing in, registering is definitely one of those flows, if only to make sure they work as expected and that you haven't managed to break into those critical flows with any of your recent changes. Whether or not you technically own the code there, it is part of your application and it should be tested. Really, you should especially test those cases. Why? Aren't those covered by the authors of the gems? Yes and no. Trust but verify. Again, you cannot guarantee that this particular library will work in the context of all the gems that you happen to be there. And there's no possible way gem authors could have every permutation of every gem that you might happen to use it with. They might not know subtle ways it could break if you happen to include gem ABC, which just so happens to monkey patch something clear across the Ruby application. We have no idea whether or not that might be happening. So at a high level, we want to at least guarantee that this is working. And that's the benefit of having a lovely capybara like me around. But we should always focus on our own code as well. And these high-level flows are what users expect our application to do, and we should have some reasonable guarantees that they work as expected. Let's focus on a high-level flow for user count, joining a group, headed out for supper after a conference. But that was a lot of data modeling, a lot of terminology, so let's take a step back and say what exactly our data model vaguely looks like here. So we start out with a gathering, like let's say RailsConf, which has many outings, which might be something like supper tonight, and it has many accounts, which might be people that are attending that conference. The outings, of course, might be supper tonight, or it might be karaoke, or it might be any other number of things we don't know. And the groups happen to be the individual groups that are going to that, because you're not going to have 100 people trying to go into one poor restaurant. We hope not, at least. And then we can add a few more helpers to make this easier. Like this login helper, for instance, which wraps the idea of authenticating to our site, because we're going to be doing this a lot as we end up testing things. We want to make sure that we can create a user and log in as that user. And then the last part of our setup might be that we have a factory which does a reasonable approximation of a gathering. In this case, we're emulating a strange human event called RailsConf 2023. Now, given those, we'll go ahead and fill out some of the setup code real quick and put a binding.irb there for another run. We need an account that can log in. We also need supper, which, by the way, should be in Eastern time because time zones are notoriously difficult. We should make sure that we're not running in Pacific time for something which happens to be in Eastern time. That would give a very unpleasant experience. Ask me how I know. And then we want to actually create the actual outing, which would be RailsConf 2023. We want to visit the homepage, log in, and then we want to stop right there and figure out what exactly are we trying to test here. In this case, we're trying to test that a user can join a group for an outing. To start with, we have our front page after the user logs in. We want to start by clicking on the name of our gathering, RailsConf 2023, which happens to be a link. So we can use click on here and use the name of our factory to click on that, which brings us to the gathering page. And now we want to do something like click on day one supper. So let's go ahead and click on that as well. And now we should probably pretty this up later, but for now, let's just hit the join group button and see what happens. Okay. Looks like they can indeed join a group, but what's with the names there? Explain that to me, I'm confused. Oh, right, I had an idea to make a distinctish name, so I made a combination of an adjective, a color, an animal name, and part of a UUID just in case to make sure it's unique. Okay, well, I understand the intention of the name, but it might not be clear what function that serves on the page. Perhaps you could add something like group name as a prefix to it to clarify what exactly that name happens to be. Otherwise, especially screen readers, might have no idea why in the world they have hilarious emerald jackal showing up on their page. Now, getting to the rest of the content, let's write a few expectations real quick just to make sure that we have a list of members and that our account shows up on the page too. Now, you might notice that there's something very interesting here and a slight problem. Namely, that the email address shows up in both the header if they don't have a profile name, as well as in the members list. So how do we guarantee that that was actually in the members section instead of in the header? Because you just asked me to search the entire page. I can't guarantee you that I'm looking at the right thing. Well, is there a way to tell Capybara specifically where to look then? There is, and with semantic HTML, we can see that the page has a header and a main section, and the main section is what we're primarily testing against. So let's use within here, which allows us to act within a scope or within a certain element and only search within that area. Now, be careful not to abuse this too much, and when possible, avoid using CSS classes here because that can become very brittle, and then I become a very temperamental capybara. We'll cover this more in a moment, but the short version is query like a person might use the page, not as a machine. Otherwise, again, I will be very, very brittle indeed. Back to it though, we'll want to make sure to keep a hold of that header text as the previous page will list it, and we want to make sure that it's actually there. Remember, if you add that prefix of group name, the text will be different, so you will have to clean up that text, and that will cause your specs to break. In the meantime, though, we can actually extract that and get back hilarious emerald jackal 1A, whatever in the world that happens to be. Now, since we have that, we can go back to the outing page, because if you happen to join an outing, you should probably not be able to join a new outing or a new group. You should have what in the world your group happens to be. So let's go ahead and click back to outing just to guarantee that this is working as expected. Because again, it doesn't make much sense to join a group to someone who already has a group, and we want to confirm this behavior works. We can use a prefix like your group is and then show exactly where you're at. Eventually, we'll probably want to make this information admin only and make sure the test is not visible to people that shouldn't have access to it. You already have action policy running, so you can very much build on top of this. Now, the last two expectations here might be that the group name happens to be visible and the join button is not, because we want to make sure, again, that you cannot join if you already have a group, because it wouldn't make sense to have multiple groups. Now, altogether, this might look a bit like this. Personally, I like to describe individual sections of the page I'm testing, but things like modals might make that difficult, which do not exist necessarily in the main element. This is especially valuable if you happen to use a JavaScript or CSS bundler, which puts content in the head of your page. And as a Capybara, I like to make sure to read all of your code, and I like to make sure to whitespace normalize it so I can read it. So if you happen to make me read 12,000 lines of JavaScript and CSS, you'll find that I happen to be a little bit slow at doing so. Now, this is all well and good, but one complaint I always hear is that I'm brittle. So let's take a look into that and see what we can do to pretty up the site while we're at it. Part 4, on brittleness. Now, remember back to earlier when we discussed how good Capybara tests will not break on a page structure change. Well, let's say we redid the entire site with something like Bootstrap or Tailwind or Bulma, which dramatically changed the structure of the page, which introduced substantial amounts of HTML boilerplate instead of CSS classes. Our test should still pass despite those, surprisingly. Now, let's say we give it a quick styling. Our site looks completely different now. Things are rearranged, they're on different positions in the page, and there's a lot more HTML going on behind there. Considering that this is using Bulma, it makes very heavy use of CSS classes, just like Tailwind or Bootstrap might. So what do you think might happen when we run the test, given that we've now completely restructured the page, reordered everything, and made it effectively in a completely different page? Well, Capybara is brittle, isn't it? I'd expect that would fail. Well, let's give that a run real quick and see about that. Not a single failure. Interesting, isn't it? Why do you suppose that is? There's something very interesting happening here. Maybe Capybara isn't as brittle as I thought it was. Well, yes and no, to be fair, depending on how you write the test, but there are some things to keep in mind which make these substantially less brittle. As it turns out, the folks who do far more front-end development have some great ideas around this, especially around the React testing library. Now, I don't claim to be an expert in this, but I am learning, and I'll give you a brief overview of how it defines priorities for finding information and querying for tags on a page, as we're running a bit short on time. It centers around one very core idea, which is interact with the website as a human would, or rather test like a human or a lemur or a capybara, or insert whichever other animal happens to strike your fancy here. Now, the core of this concept is how you would find information on a page or querying. As with everything I mentioned here, I will share links and other such information later, but you can read more into React testing library and how it defines priorities at the above link. We'll cover them briefly today, but just so you have a reference for that for later. Now, the core concept of this is finding information on a page. Take our account creation page after the restyling. As a human, you take a look at this and you immediately want to fill in the name, email, password, and confirm password fields before hitting create account. Or in other words, you would pretty much do this in Capybara. Why does that work? Well, because fill in and click on, among many other helpers, rely on two key types of queries, which would be find something by its label and then find something by its role. And a role might be something like a button or a title. That said, these are only two, and we'll take a look at the rest of them here in a moment. So the first group, which are considered the best ways to test against a page, are considered those which are accessible to everyone. Quickly, those in order and in order of preference, and we'll have an example of each in a moment, are finding by role, by label, by placeholder, by text, and by display value. So each of these have a Capybara equivalent, and we have a test site over here on the right to sandbox this and see what happens. So the first is by role, which translates to a lot of specific helpers like have button or have link or other things which focus on the role an element has on a page. In this case, buttons have a role of button, so it would be able to find that, which is how have button and click button happen to work. The second is by label. Like form fields, we can find any field, fill it in, or perhaps even get the value out of its associated control form here. Next is placeholder. Now, we'll notice we're still using the field selector here, and that's interesting. This means the Capybara is doing more than one thing with this single method. It relies on label first, yes, but it will also go into placeholder if it can't find that label, and it will try and do the most reasonable thing it can. So in Capybara, we try and be as smart as we can about this. In this case, we can find a field by its placeholder, fill it in by its placeholder, and then get the value by that placeholder as well. After that is one many may have seen, which is finding text on a page. You can also scope this to specific elements to dial things in, as we saw with the main example earlier. And last are queries that are accessible, let's see here, for trying to get the display value, like let's say a select box. If you want to know what the value happens to be or you want to test that, you can also find an option based on its value. Next are semantic queries, which may vary across browsers and screen readers and have subtly different behavior depending on what exactly you're doing, and typically rely on ARIA properties or HTML5 semantic tags. These happen to be selecting by alt text, which would be the alt text of an image, or by title, which might be the title role of an element on the page. Semantic queries also have a Capybara equivalence. The first, you can query by an element using its alt text, much like an image, using something very similar to what we saw for getting the value, which is we can use square brackets here to get a property of a tag. Now, I wouldn't suggest doing this. I would suggest instead using any one of the other ones first, which is what React Testing Library would recommend that you do. The second is by title, which uses the ARIA role of title to find what exactly is considered to be the main title of the page. But this information isn't necessarily visible to sighted users and can be very inconsistent depending on your screen reader, your browser, and the combination thereof. Last up are test IDs, which are testing via CSS classes, which happen to be specifically targeted for testing and not styling purposes. They're recommended only to use whenever every other item has failed and it's not possible to really query against a page, such as dynamic text generation or anything else like that, and especially once they're well supported by we capybaras. Now, of course, test IDs also have a Capybara equivalent. And the way this is used is by finding a CSS class meant specifically for testing and not styling, as you can see from our HTML up there above. That said, there's a reason this is the very last on the list, and it will very rarely, if ever, be used. But even with all those things, I'm but one capybara, and a very new one at that. I'm still figuring this entire thing out, and there's only a small subset of what we capybaras can do. There's so much more out there, and quite a bit more to learn, but hopefully this gave you a good start on your own journey of dealing with capybaras. And so Karant the capybara finished his lesson, leaving young Red with much to think on and much more to learn. Time flows onwards. And so time marches on, and Red the lemur and Karant the capybara continue to learn and grow together, as do we all. And no matter what stage we happen to be on the path, we always have something to share, something to learn, and a journey ever ahead of us. And the best part, in the Ruby community, we'll always have friends to join us on that journey. So to wrap up, between illustrations, application, behind the talk, and everything else, I think we're about 170 hours over 4 weeks, so it's quite nice to be on the other side of this. So if you'd like to know who I am or would like to find any of the links, resources, or otherwise, you can find me on various social networks such as Mastodon, GitHub, Dev2, Discord, Slack, or various other things, or you can just reach out in the RailsConf Slack to say hi. Now, there is a very big disclaimer here on said application, which would be very nice for finding us supper tonight. It ain't production ready. You can't make me, I'm not doing it. Now, it'd be nifty if it was fully working and prod ready, it'd be very useful, but I can't make both a production ready application and an illustrated talk because it's a little bit beyond my realm of sanity. Maybe by RubyConf, maybe. And if you happen to know graph theory, especially around social networks, we should talk later because I don't. Though, if you do want to see what it's up to right now, it's open source, certainly a lot of work to be done, and a lot of very green pathing because, again, conference talk. So, as always, before we finish our talk today, I'd like to thank everyone around because these talks wouldn't exist without the wonderful people in our community, from all those who've encouraged me, supported me, reviewed my art, watched early versions of the talk, or even said a kind word. Thank you so much for being there. But community is a very fragile thing. We must be very careful to protect those that would do it harm, intentionally or otherwise. How the most vulnerable are treated, joked about, or otherwise regarded in our community is a reflection on who we are and what our values are. So we must reject all such forms of hatred without reservation and so clearly that we welcome all. And with that said, that's all I have for today.